I will never forget the exact moment my father stopped breathing in the middle of my grandfather's will reading. Because line 7 on that thin piece of legal paper detonated a 40-year-old secret right in the center of our family living room. And the look on my dad's face was something I am genuinely never going to be able to unsee for the rest of my life. Picture it with me. 12 relatives crammed into my late grandfather's sun-drenched study on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The smell of old books and cedarwood floating in the air. A soft-spoken estate lawyer in a slightly wrinkled gray suit sitting at the head of the antique desk, clearing his throat the way lawyers do when they know something dramatic is about to come out of their mouth. And my father sitting in the front row with his arms crossed, looking smug and impatient like he already knew exactly what he was going to inherit. And meanwhile, I was tucked in the back next to my aunt, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, secretly hoping this whole thing would be over fast so I could go home and grieve in peace. Because my grandfather and I had been incredibly close, and the idea of strangers fighting over his things made my stomach turn. The lawyer started reading from the top. Line 1, line 2, line 3, all the standard legal language about being of sound mind. No coercion, full understanding, the kind of opening paragraphs nobody actually listens to. And you could see the family slowly leaning forward in their chairs, waiting for the juicy parts. The house, the savings, the vintage car collection my grandfather had spent 50 years building in his garage. Line 4 mentioned small personal items going to my cousins. Line 5 split a modest savings account between my aunts. Line 6 gave the antique pocket watch to me, specifically with a handwritten note that said, "For the only grandchild who actually listened," and I felt tears spring up immediately because that small sentence felt more valuable than any house could ever be. But it was line 7 that changed everything. And to this day, I cannot read those words back without my hands going cold. The lawyer paused for just a second, looked up at my father and read aloud. To my son Richard, I leave the contents of the locked safety deposit box at First National, the key to which is attached to this document, along with the original 1984 letter and the accompanying paternity records, which I trust he will finally have the courage to discuss honestly with his wife and children. And the entire room went so completely silent, you could literally hear the second hand on the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. My father made this strange choking sound, the kind of sound that comes out of a person when their body forgets how to function for a second. His hands started visibly trembling on his knees. His face drained from pink to white to almost gray within about 10 seconds. And he stopped breathing. I mean, genuinely stopped, not for a long time. Just long enough for my mother to grab his arm and ask if he was okay. But in that small, frozen pause, every single person in that room understood something massive had just happened, even if we did not yet know exactly what. My aunt whispered the word paternity under her breath. My cousin's mouth fell open. My mother slowly turned her head toward my father with a look I will never forget, a mixture of confusion and the very first hint of a dawning, terrible suspicion, and I just sat there clutching my coffee cup, my brain racing through every weird family moment from the past 27 years that suddenly, horrifyingly, started to make sense. The lawyer, bless him, stayed completely professional, and he simply said that the rest of the document could be reviewed privately if needed. But my grandmother, yes, my grandfather's widow, sitting 2 seats away from my father, slowly raised her hand and said in this incredibly calm, almost rehearsed voice that no, she wanted the rest of the will read out loud right now in front of everyone, because she had waited over 4 decades for this exact moment. And the way she said it gave me goosebumps from the top of my head to the soles of my feet. The lawyer hesitated, looked around the room, and then continued. Line 8 stated that the family home on Maple Street, the one my father had been bragging about inheriting for years, the one he had already started measuring for new furniture, was being left entirely to me grandmother for her lifetime and then directly to me, his granddaughter, completely bypassing my father and skipping an entire generation of the family inheritance line. And I watched my father's expression collapse like a building in slow motion, because in the span of 2 sentences he had gone from confident heir to a man whose deepest secret was being unwrapped in front of his wife, his mother, his daughter, and his entire extended family. Line 9 was even sharper. It stated that my grandfather had personally funded my college education through a separate trust because, and I quote directly from the document the lawyer read, "My son Richard repeatedly refused to support his daughter's ambitions, and I will not allow my granddaughter's future to be sacrificed for his pride." And at this point, my mother stood up. Her face flushed red, and walked out of the room without saying a single word to my father, which honestly told me more about what was in that safety deposit box than anything else could have. Because she clearly already had her suspicions, And this was simply the confirmation she had been quietly carrying for years. The next 10 minutes were a blur of overlapping voices, my aunts asking questions, my cousins whispering, my father trying to defend himself before anyone had even accused him of anything specific, saying things like, "This is not what it looks like," and "We should not be discussing this here." But my grandmother just sat in her armchair with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching her son squirm with the patient expression of a woman who had been planning this exact afternoon for a very, very long time. Later that evening, after the relatives had finally cleared out, after my mother had locked herself in the upstairs bedroom and my father had retreated to the back porch, chain-smoking cigarettes he had supposedly quit years ago, my grandmother quietly asked me to sit with her in the kitchen. She poured me a cup of chamomile tea, slid a small unopened envelope across the table toward me, and told me that my grandfather had written a personal letter for me that the lawyer had handed her separately. And she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life, she said. "Your grandfather knew that secrets only have power as long as they stay hidden, and he refused to let your father's lies define our family for another generation." Inside that envelope was a handwritten note in my grandfather's familiar shaky cursive, telling me that he was sorry he could not give me the truth in person, that he had discovered the details about my father's hidden double life years ago, through a private investigator he had quietly hired after noticing strange financial inconsistencies, that the safety deposit box contained documentation of a second household my father had been secretly maintaining for nearly 2 decades, complete with another woman, financial records, and yes, a paternity test confirming a half-sibling I had never known existed. And reading those words alone in that kitchen at midnight, while my grandmother gently held my hand, felt like the entire foundation of my childhood was being rewritten, paragraph by paragraph in real time. Now I know what some of you watching this are going to say. You are going to say that my grandfather should have handled this privately, that exposing a man in front of his entire family was cruel, that the will reading was not the appropriate place for this kind of revelation. And honestly, a small part of me even wondered that myself for the first few days. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood exactly what my grandfather had done and why. Because for 40 years, my father had used the appearance of being a respectable family man as a shield. He had manipulated my mother emotionally. He had withheld money from me as a teenager while spending freely on his secret second life. He had lied to his own father's face at Sunday dinners. And the only language a man like that ever truly understands is the public, undeniable, witnessed truth. And my grandfather, in his quiet, brilliant way, made sure that when the truth finally came out, it came out in a room full of witnesses who could never again be gaslit into pretending it had not happened. My mother filed for divorce within 6 weeks. And to my surprise, she told me it was honestly a relief, because the suspicions had been eating her alive for years, and she had simply lacked the proof to act on them. My father tried desperately to reach out to me through letters, voicemails, and even a couple of in-person visits where he wept on my doorstep. But every time I looked at him, I just saw line 7 of that will reading. I saw his hands shaking, I saw the moment he stopped breathing, and I realized that the man who had spent my whole childhood telling me that honesty was the most important value in life had been living the biggest lie of all, and I simply could not bring myself to pretend otherwise for the sake of family peace. The half-sibling, by the way, eventually reached out to me through a careful, polite email about a year later, and she turned out to be a genuinely lovely person who had also been lied to her entire life, told that her father was a traveling businessman who could only visit a few times a month. And we slowly built a real relationship from the wreckage, which is honestly the one beautiful thing that came out of that entire afternoon. Because 2 daughters who had been kept apart by one man's cowardice finally got to know each other, thanks to one grandfather's courage. I sometimes drive past the old house on Maple Street, the one that is legally mine now, but that my grandmother still happily lives in, and I think about how a single line in a legal document, line 7, ended one chapter of our family forever and started a much more honest one. And I think about how my grandfather, in his last act on this earth, managed to do what nobody else had ever been brave enough to do. He forced the truth into the light, and even though the truth shattered the version of family I thought I had, it gave me something far more valuable in return, a real one built on facts instead of fairy tales. And to this day, whenever someone asks me what the most defining moment of my life was, I do not hesitate. I tell them it was the exact second my grandfather's will was read out loud. The lawyer paused, and my father stopped breathing.